What if you were stopped by a police officer in your neighborhood who threatened your life? What if the police were not just enforcing the law but abusing it? How would you react if a gun was pointed at you just because you were black? What would you do? And let's see how the black woman in the story handled it. The red and blue lights pulsed in the rearview mirror, painting the quiet suburban street in uneasy color. Danielle Monroe exhaled through her nose, her fingers tightening around the leather steering wheel as she guided her black Tesla Model X smoothly to the curb. The neighborhood of Alexandria, Virginia, just a short drive from Washington, D.C., was the kind of place where the lawns were manicured, the sidewalks silent, and every mailbox matched. She had lived here for 12 years, paid her taxes, attended PTA meetings, donated to local causes. And yet, this moment still happened. She glanced in the mirror again, her reflection calm, composed, familiar. Her curls were pinned neatly back, her makeup subtle, her charcoal gray blazer unwrinkled despite the long workday. She looked like what she was, chief financial officer at one of the top tech firms in the country. And still, here she was. She wasn't surprised she got pulled over, she was just tired of it. Danielle slowly reached over to her passenger seat and tapped the record button on her phone, not because she expected to go viral, but because she knew that her truth might be the only version that mattered. Outside, the patrol car's door opened, and the moment began. Danielle kept her eyes on the side mirror as the door of the patrol car creaked open. The officer stepped out slowly, like he had all the time in the world. Mid-40s, white, broad-shouldered with a military-cut haircut and a look on his face that seemed carved from stone. His strides were firm, calculated, like someone who had walked this walk 1,000 times and always expected control to follow behind him. Officer Ryan Becker. She didn't know his name yet, but the way he carried himself told her everything she needed to know. The badge glinted under the soft glow of the street lamp. His belt was fully loaded, radio, baton, taser, and most notably, the holstered gun his hand hovered near just a bit too comfortably. Danielle's breathing stayed steady as she glanced at her phone screen, confirming that the recording was still rolling. She placed it on the passenger seat, angled just enough to catch his approach. This wasn't paranoia. It was preparation, a habit born from experience, not fear. The knock on the window was hard, 2 short taps, not aggressive but not friendly either. Danielle pressed the button and lowered the window halfway. Her tone was cool, polite. "Good evening, officer." Becker leaned forward slightly, squinting in. "License and registration," he said flatly. No greeting, no explanation, straight to the demand. Danielle kept her hands firmly on the wheel. "I'll get those for you in a moment," she replied evenly. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Becker's lips pressed into a thin line. "You didn't signal at that last turn." A lie, she knew it. She signaled every time out of sheer habit, but she didn't argue, not yet. "I see," she said. "My license and registration are in my purse. I'm going to reach for them now." He didn't nod, didn't reassure, just stared. Danielle moved slowly, deliberately. No sudden movements. She unzipped her purse and retrieved the documents with care, passing them through the half-open window. Becker snatched them with a practiced flick of the wrist, but instead of examining them, he looked her over. The way his eyes lingered on her blazer, the slim gold necklace around her collarbone, the pearl earrings that glinted in the light, it wasn't just observation. It was assessment, discomfort. "You live around here?" he asked casually. Danielle's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes, just a few blocks away." Becker glanced at the license, then back at her. "What brings you to this part of the neighborhood tonight?" The question hit her like a slap in disguise. She offered a polite, practiced smile. "I'm heading home. Is that a problem?" Becker leaned back slightly, but his eyes didn't soften. He didn't like that answer. Too confident, too clear. Danielle saw it, the shift in his posture, the flicker of irritation in his gaze. And she knew this wasn't about a turned signal. This was about presence, her presence, in a place he didn't think she belonged. Officer Becker hadn't moved from the side of the Tesla. If anything, he seemed to be settling in for a longer interaction than necessary. "You know," he said, voice low and tight, "most people in this neighborhood don't drive around looking suspicious." Danielle turned her head slowly, expression unshaken. "Suspicious, because I'm going home from work in a clean car," Becker smirked. "Just saying, you stand out." "I live here," she repeated, her tone measured but sharp. "As I said before, you have my license, it's a local address." He tapped the edge of the car door with his fingers, still not looking at the documents in his hand. "Nice car," he added. "Finance or lease?" Danielle blinked once, then smiled faintly. "Paid in full." That seemed to irritate him more than it should have. He took a step back and looked over the car again as if the vehicle itself were somehow incriminating. Then, without warning, he reached down and gripped the door handle. Danielle's instincts fired in an instant. Her hand darted to the console, and the lock clicked just before his fingers could pull it open. He jerked the handle twice. The door didn't budge. Her heart pounded once hard, but her face remained calm. Becker's face changed. Less smug now, more annoyed. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice louder this time. "On what grounds?" Danielle asked evenly. He took a step closer. "Don't play games with me, ma'am." "I'm not," she replied. "I'm asking for a legal justification." "You're being uncooperative," she raised her eyebrows. "Uncooperative isn't illegal. Am I being detained?" Becker's nostrils flared. "You are now." Danielle tilted her head. "Then I request your supervisor be called to the scene." Becker hesitated. Not because she was wrong. He knew the law well enough to understand she had a right to ask, but because it undercut his authority. His ego was bruised, and bruised egos were dangerous. A light flicked on across the street, then another. A woman in her bathrobe stepped onto her porch, phone in hand, frowning. Danielle didn't turn her head, but she noticed the shift in atmosphere. Suburbia didn't often see drama unfold on its streets, and definitely not like this. Becker noticed too. "You've got quite the audience," he muttered, almost to himself. "I'm recording as well," Danielle said, her voice projecting slightly, "for my protection." "You think that scares me?" he snapped. "No," she said. "I think it holds people accountable." Another man stepped out onto the sidewalk across the street. Then another. A teenager angled his phone from behind a parked car, clearly filming. Becker glanced around, suddenly aware of how visible he'd become. But visibility didn't deter him. If anything, it made him more rigid. "I asked you to step out of the car," he repeated, louder this time. "And I asked for your supervisor," Danielle replied, unwavering. "Unless you have probable cause, I am within my rights to remain in my vehicle." She could feel her pulse under her skin, steady but alert. She had studied the law, lived through lectures on civil liberties, sat in rooms where legislation was crafted. She knew exactly what was within her rights, and she also knew that none of it guaranteed safety. Becker stared at her through the half-open window. His eyes held a mix of something, frustration, confusion, but most of all, resentment. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't flustered. And that, for him, was unacceptable. He had pulled over a woman he expected to control. Instead, he was losing grip of the moment, of the authority of the narrative. More phones were out now. Danielle could feel the presence of witnesses growing behind the stillness of her tinted windows. And yet, she didn't let herself feel relief. She knew too many names, too many outcomes that still ended in tragedy. The sound of a dog barking in the distance momentarily punctuated the silence. A car down the street slowed, the driver leaning slightly to look. Lights from more windows flicked on like a slow wave of attention. Becker's jaw clenched. He straightened, stepping back and pressing one hand to his belt, fingers resting too close to his holster. It wasn't quite a threat, but it was a message. Danielle didn't flinch. She kept her voice steady. "Everything is being documented. I've done nothing wrong." "Neither have I," Becker snapped, louder than before. "If that's true," Danielle said calmly, "then there should be no issue waiting for your supervisor." His eyes narrowed. For a second, it looked like he might say something else, but then he stopped. The tension between them was no longer invisible. It was alive, heavy in the air. And for the first time, Danielle could tell he was unsure what to do next. For a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, Officer Becker's hand moved. Fast, too fast. His fingers curled around the grip of his holstered gun and drew it in one smooth, practiced motion. The metal caught the porch lights as he raised the weapon, arm extended, pointing it squarely at Danielle's head through the glass. Gasps erupted from the sidewalk. Someone screamed. A phone clattered to the pavement across the street. Danielle didn't move. Her body went cold, but her face was stone. Her hand stayed on the steering wheel, the other still resting near the phone on the passenger seat, its red recording light blinking steadily. The barrel of the gun didn't waver. Neither did she. "You just pulled a gun," she said, her voice calm but loud enough for the entire block to hear, "on the wife of the Director of National Intelligence." The words cut through the thick air like a blade. Becker blinked. For a moment his expression cracked, his grip on the gun loosened ever so slightly. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Across the street someone muttered, "Did she just say?" Another voice, closer this time, "She's married to the DNI." Whispers spread like sparks on dry grass. Becker's arm twitched. The crowd was growing. Dozens of phones now, aimed, recording. The performance he thought he controlled had just turned into a courtroom, and he was the only one on trial. Before he could recover, a voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. "Officer Becker, stand down." The sound of boots on pavement followed. A tall woman in a navy blue uniform strode into view from behind Becker's cruiser. Her badge caught the streetlight. Her tone brooked no debate. "Captain Laura Green." Danielle had never met her, but the woman's presence filled the block instantly. Becker turned his head slightly startled. "Captain," I said, "lower your weapon. Now." The words were ice. For a heartbeat, Becker didn't move. Danielle could see the internal war behind his eyes, the need to save face, the fear of backing down, the decades of unchecked control unraveling in front of a suburban audience and a camera lens. He started, but the words faltered. Captain Green stepped forward. "You are pointing a loaded firearm at an unarmed civilian during a traffic stop. Lower your weapon." Becker's jaw clenched. The gun wavered. Another phone caught the exact second it dipped. He lowered it. Not entirely, just enough to break the line of fire. The crowd collectively exhaled. "Holster it," Green ordered. Becker hesitated again, then with a grunt of frustration, shoved the gun back into its holster. His hands, once so steady, were now trembling. Danielle still hadn't moved. She didn't need to. Because in that single moment, the balance of power had shifted. She had cracked him. And now the whole world was watching him fall apart. Captain Laura Green stepped closer to Becker, her voice now calm but deadly serious. "Officer Becker," she said, eyes locked on him, "I'm placing you on administrative leave pending investigation. Hand over your badge and your weapon." Becker stood stiff, his face pale beneath the flickering street lamp. For a moment it looked like he might refuse, but the murmurs of the growing crowd, the dozens of eyes, the dozens of phones, told him there was no way out. His fingers fumbled at his chest as he unpinned his badge, the same one he'd worn for over 2 decades. Then he reached for his belt and slowly unhooked the holster, his hands shaking as he handed it over. Green took both without a word and stepped back. "Internal Affairs will be notified immediately," she added, turning toward her radio. "This will be handled by the book." Danielle sat silently in her car, her hands still on the wheel. Her phone, still recording, captured every second. Captain Green turned to her with a firm but respectful nod. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Danielle looked at Becker, then at Green. "I'm not here for apologies," she said evenly. "I want accountability, officially." Green didn't flinch. "You'll have it." The moment held for another beat, then Green stepped away to manage the scene. The crowd was still buzzing, voices filled with disbelief, outrage, and something else, admiration. Danielle finally reached over and ended the recording on her phone. It had done its job. By the time she arrived home, the footage had already started spreading. A neighbor had uploaded it before she even got out of her car. Within an hour, it had hit Twitter, Reddit, and multiple Facebook groups. The video was raw, unedited, and damning. Her inbox exploded, texts from friends, colleagues, even people she hadn't spoken to in years. Journalists were calling. Podcasts were tagging her name. Activist groups were already drafting statements, and then one name lit up her screen: Marcus. Her husband's voice came through instantly, clipped and controlled. "Danielle, are you safe?" "I am," she said, her voice quiet now that the adrenaline had faded. "I'm home." There was a pause, then colder. "What's his name?" She closed her eyes. "Ryan Becker." She didn't have to say more. Marcus had already started making calls. The next morning, headlines exploded across every major news outlet. "Police officer pulls gun on DNI's wife during routine stop." "Caught on camera, traffic stop escalates into national scandal." "Danielle Monroe incident sparks nationwide demands for police reform." Danielle didn't smile as she read them. She didn't feel victorious. She felt steady, because this time, the right person was finally being held accountable. Danielle Monroe didn't see herself as a hero. She hadn't spoken louder than necessary. She hadn't fought back or raised her voice. She hadn't demanded attention. She had simply stood her ground with grace, with clarity, and with truth. But in the days that followed, her name became something else. A symbol, not just for women like her, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, doubted, or dismissed because of who they were or how they looked. What happened on that quiet street in Alexandria wasn't just about a routine stop gone wrong. It was about a system too accustomed to getting away with it. A culture that had allowed arrogance to replace accountability. Danielle hadn't planned to become a headline, but once she did, she refused to let it be wasted. The footage of Officer Becker pulling a gun on an unarmed woman, a law-abiding citizen, replayed across newsrooms and timelines like a warning flare. The message was clear: power does not excuse abuse. Uniforms do not protect misconduct. And silence only shields the wrong people. Danielle received thousands of messages, some in thanks, some in outrage. But one stuck with her more than the others. "You reminded me to keep filming, to keep speaking, to keep surviving." And that, she thought, was worth everything. So if you're reading this, or watching, or listening, take this moment with you. If you believe in justice, share this story. Because staying silent, that's how the wrong people win.